My name is Kacy Boccumini. I work for Sony Pictures in distribution for 17 years, because I started when I was about 10. And I'm also, I have a master's degree in film theory, because I was going to be a professor, and also I'm an independent filmmaker. And also, I'm the president of Out at Sony Pictures, which is our employee research business group, and currently the only openly trans person that works at Sony Pictures. Which is a big problem, because there cannot just be one of us, considering how rampant trans and non-binary representation is in our industry. So, the reason why I'm giving you all of those accolades is to say, none of us are never just one thing, right? So when you say underrepresented, you mean lots of different things all at once. And so I kind of want to unpack from my experience, as Roxanne shared so eloquently about her experience growing up. You know, when I watched Pretty in Pink when I was 5, they were all white, they were all straight, they were all cis, so class was the thing that was the issue, right? Like, there was someone who was very wealthy and someone who was kind of poorer, and that you know, the message there was, there's this difference between us, but you can still love somebody who's somewhat different than you. And so, I kind of want to start by this creating underrepresentation. Like, so to this panel, what constitutes underrepresentation? Does it begin with the audience? Does it begin with the content, or the subject matter, or the filmmakers? Can it be both? Like, let's kind of talk about what it is we're addressing. And, you know, Dennis, do you want to start as the filmmaker, or, you know, as the curator? Paige, do you want to start? Just who wants to jump in on this?
I mean, I can jump in. I think generally for Shout, it's really important to us. We have a mission to really be champions for underserved stories and storytellers, which I think is part of Shout's DNA. I mean, we're coming from Rhino Records. Some of you may know back in the day, maybe even walked in the store back in the day. But really bringing, we want to bring these sort of unforgotten gems to light and be able to share these stories, give them exposure or education, or, you know, an avenue for a broader market reach that they may not have otherwise had. One good example is The Sound of Identity, which is something we put out, I believe, in 2021, which is the story of a transgender opera singer. And, you know, we didn't go out for that specifically with the goal of making profit or anything like that. It's really important for us to be able to bring this story out and give it that really wide reach.
I think it's actually interesting, you know, I think your TV is so wonderful, and also all the other organizations that you have, you know, my transition was announced in The Advocate, which is like amazing, which is part of the organization also. But we forget that, like, every other movie that is not LGBTIAQ focused is also about sexuality. We just don't explicitly call it out. So it's things like that, right? Like, there are films that you think about that are not considered black films that have mostly black people in them, but they don't belong to a specific canon. So how important is that context? Like, from a storefront perspective, how?
Sure. So I oversee the programming and operations department, and, you know, what Roxanne said about it is, you know, I was given this opportunity, and with the latter, it was important to me when, you know, Catholic Pond, who leads our group, hired me, that I said I want to have a diverse group behind the scenes, right? And when I mean behind the scenes, the decision makers who curate the content. So the head of my programming team happens to be both an Afro-Latino man and a Latino woman. And that's important because, you know, it's one thing when the content's diverse, but the folks behind the scenes making those decisions and programming. And I'm not speaking to just our Latino channel or our black channel. I'm talking about our horror channel, our sci-fi channel, our action, our food and travel channels. We have 10 O&O. And these two, you know, all-stars of my team are responsible for programming, curating, and working with our content acquisitions team and identifying the content. Granted, we use data, but having that representation is not, you know, not behind the camera, but actually behind the platform, is figuring out what works. What works is key, you know, to make sure that our VIZIO audiences has the content they want.
Mm-hmm. And Paul, what are your takes?
Well, I approach everything from story, in the sense, and what I mean is not just a story about an underrepresented group. it's really hard to find a well-structured story. So I spend most of my day looking at dozens of different pitches, scripts, to try to find a well-structured one. What I can tell you that right now, the best stuff coming through my door is coming from people of color. I don't exactly know why that's happening. Maybe it's because there's a change in what people think is possible. So I think that's important, because if that's what's happening, then we've done something well, because we're encouraging people. I have a lot of problem with young people trying to get them interested in making film and television. They all want to be influencers. And I go to speak at UCLA, where I think I'm going to get these great minds. Oh yeah, I want to be an influencer. It's like, and I want to kill myself. So it's kind of, I try to remind them that AI is going to replace all the influencers shortly, and they really should try to focus on something more human, like their stories. But right now, the better stories are coming through for our queer filmmakers of color. Great, because those are the ones I get to tell. So part of it, I think, is society as a backdrop, right? What people think of as what's possible. So more people get involved and engaged, which means more stories, which means more people behind the scenes, in front of the scenes. So I think we're on a good trajectory right now, probably for a variety of reasons. But overall, a good trajectory.
About 100 years ago, film, like in 1931, horror films came out, right? And it taught people what to be afraid of. And oftentimes, those movies taught people how to be afraid of us, like all of us. And that is honestly the most influential thing that you can do, is watch a movie. They are designed to teach you how to feel and react and emote by adding music and color and shot. This is a vehicle for storytelling based on emotion, and evoking and manipulating your emotion to get to something, to the core of it. So there is no better way to influence anyone than to make a movie about it.
By the way, one of the first great horror films, Frankenstein, directed by James Whale, queer filmmaker, and the subject of my film, Gods and Monsters, which won an Oscar. So there you go.
So segueing, Dennis, as a filmmaker, what's your approach to this? Like, how do you start with the audience? Do you start with the content? Do you start with the story?
I just wanted to say, this is genius, man. I didn't know. I was
Yeah.
like, which one? You're a pro at this, apparently.
Done this before.
Okay. My approach, well, I think it's good to just set the stage of my philosophy and my perspective is, which I think is really a true statement, is that Black culture specifically is leading all main popular culture, period, around the world, and especially the United States. So that's kind of how I approach everything. It's like it's more from leadership. And then when I think about building Black and Sexy, or any other vertical, or any other platform we're talking about, that is currently, I'm not talking about, but is currently happening, is about owning the audience. So I'm really audience-centric, and I think, you're about solving problems for people. It's going to be a lot more stickier than just trying to throw programming at them and see what works. I think if you're looking at them, everybody up there is talking about people that are typically overlooked in probably all aspects of life, or overlooked in negative aspects of life. So if you're actually speaking to that, solving that problem, but removing the friction of, I don't like using the word minority, and this is what I mean by friction. We're not a minority, actually. It's just a tag that keeps us in that same place. So when I say audience-centric, it's identity, everything Paige was talking about. It's really about thinking about being a utility for that audience and owning that audience. That to me is a more sort of a stronger approach. And then whatever you put out, it's not about living or dying by a show. It's really about super serving that audience in a way that reflects them, in a way that they're not being reflected in everything else in life. So,
I love that. I absolutely love that. And I think that, when we talk about, way back in the 1960s, prior to home video, in the home video space, there was just the movie theater. And movie theaters, like, there was a very small amount of places where you could get content, you could see content, but then VHS changed that a lot, right? They brought content into the home, and then, streaming and digital and OTT.X completely opened that up. So how can we now talk about this new landscape where we have thousands of channels and thousands of different ways to get to audiences? Like, how does this present opportunities? How does this present opportunities to sort of serve these communities, but also what are the challenges still in the OTT.X space that present new opportunities in the future? Yeah, anyone?
I just think monetization is the challenge. Access is no longer the challenge. Access has been solved. Anyone, can get content out to anyone right now. But, I have content creators who put stuff out on YouTube. They're like, oh, I got 200,000 views. I'm like, great. How much money should we get? $5.80. It's like, okay, that doesn't work. So you have to monetize it. And so the trick with how do you monetize something when distribution is no longer a barrier to entry? So the reason OTT.X exists is because now there's no barrier to entry. The discussion, especially for content for underrepresented people, is okay, how do we monetize this so we can make more? Because if there's no monetary model, there's no content.
Yeah.
So I think it's just like podcasting. It's the same thing Paul was just saying. There's a lot of access. It's easy to get a podcast up. I think it's more about attention and discovery and focus. Monetization, I think, will come. But you got to grab people's attention. And as you were just really setting up, there's too many options, a lot of options. So it's great to be a consumer now. We can get all the music we want for the same price of a CD every month that we used to get. So it's great for the consumer, bad for business. And so we're all competing for people's time, and I think that is the biggest challenge.
From a store point, yeah.
I was going to say.
Yeah.
For us on the platform, we're an integrated platform. We own the hardware, we own the software, as well as the data. How many of you have had what I call content fatigue stroke, right? Where you're just scrolling about, right? What's important is how you present the content for a specific audience. And for us at VIZIO, we look at data. We serve not just demographically, we're a 4-quadrant, east to west coast, but really looking at a household. Because you could look at 2 different households, might be from the same community, but one might like true crime and one might like westerns and what have you. So for us, our home screen team works closely with our program and editorial team to kind of also utilize data and serving specific households via content recommendation, via the content we're promoting, ensuring that, hey, we're going to serve you that content when you turn on your TV, because that solves half the equation of just getting on the platform and then scrolling, endlessly scrolling, right? Because otherwise you end up just watching The Office all day long. So.
When I was young and the internet was new, it used to be a very filthy place. Like, it was completely unregulated. You would go search something and you'd have a billion sites. You'd never have any understanding of what it is you were looking, or the thing that you even attempted to buy was going to be real, or that you were going to get taken somewhere. And now it's become a very sanitized, very regulated place. The internet is squeaky clean, which means that because we're all trying to monetize something, we have a sort of regulation. So I wanted to talk to you, Paige, about there are countries where it is illegal to be queer, right? So that content, because these are things that are federally regulated, can't be shown safely. So how does that present a challenge for reaching certain audiences, given the restrictions of ad money?
It's a tough question, especially because if our content, some of it may not even be global, so it has a harder time going there anyways. But I don't know if there's a right answer, because is it in your best interest to over sanitize something in the spirit of meeting that? We run into that with just editing things for content, like nudity or language or things like that. But at what point are you crossing a line and now over-censoring something and taking away from a viewer's ability to learn or educate themselves about something? And I don't know if there's a right or wrong.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if it's the underrepresented audiences that are having to be censored the most in order to be able to dip into this monetization, right? I don't think there's lots of communities that are not burdened by this, but I feel like ours are. Yeah, go ahead.
I would say a good example is black and sexy together is too strong for a lot of people, especially advertisers. But it spoke directly to who we're talking to. It either turned you off or turned you on, literally. So to me, the marketing was built in, but I experienced that many times just the sexy and the black was just too much. So
It says no one on this panel right now, or no one in this room. Absolutely not. Also, I'm going to add sexy to my LinkedIn immediately, because that's the message. That's it. I love it. It's great branding. It's great branding. So we have this conversation, right? This buzzword called authenticity, right? When you're either looking at content or being represented by content. So that's sort of how something is represented evolves over time. And I think, Paige, you and I spoke about this when we had our pre-meeting. So I always get this example, right? Every June, my marketing team sends me a list of titles, and they go, hey, we want to market stuff for Pride. And my best friend's wedding is the top of that list. And I'm like, that is not a Pride title. That is not a movie about a lived experience of being gay. And so please stop suggesting this title. Stop thinking about my community as just characters that appear. Whereas Taxi Driver technically could be considered in the queer canon because Jodie Foster is in it, and she's an openly queer actress. No one would ever think to market that movie during Pride, nor do they think to market A League of Their Own during the World Series, despite the fact that that movie is literally about women in baseball who've been erased because of the way in which the keywords are managed, or the genre is managed, or their understanding of it. It's also one of the gayest movies in the world, and no one ever markets it during Pride. So, I want to talk a little bit about, how do we, from a metadata perspective, which so clearly drives the storefront and drives the marketing and drives the placement, how can we think about these movies differently in order to be able to renew them and evolve with them over time?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'm glad you brought it up because we utilize a lot of internal keywords to help surface that kind of content. Like you're saying, sometimes the year comes around and all of a sudden we're really interested in doing these tentpoles, and for us, well, this is quality content. We should just have it available all the time, not just because it's June or it's February or whatever the case may be. And I think it's interesting because you touched on something where just because it's tagged a certain way doesn't mean, it's a one-size-fits-all. We found out, like, Elvira's movie, now she's sort of come out with her book and everything like that, but there was a huge crossover with that community and Elvira's movie, macabre and horror generally. And you may not know that, but that's just, again, as part of the authenticity. We're very in touch, or we like to think we're very in touch with that audience. We can feed on that reception we get on socials and elsewhere and really understand that they resonate with that, just like they might resonate with Lucille Ball, and so that maybe we'll run some Carol Burnett stuff or whatever the case may be. It may just be that this particular character or actor has a tie-in with the community, even if they're not necessarily from it themselves. So I think there's ways to play on it.
For us, what we utilize, and I talk about programming, art and science, the art being obviously my two programming leads, but the science being data. And like for us, our Inscape data team looks at, not just the metadata, but also the households, the different audience data, and really looks at what those audiences are looking at, and besides recommending it, taking those insights back and programming to it. So like last year, technically this year, this year is going to end soon, we launched a very number of pop-up channels as well as hubs for Black History Month, celebrating API, celebrating Pride, and continuing on, and in looking from that and saying, hey, why can't this content continue to live beyond that, given what you said, we saw the number spike, so why don't we start programming, and we kind of take those learnings so that there's an audience for this, or it's working well, why can't we expand beyond the month that it's obviously marketed by corporate America, and go beyond and just get more of that content. So we're always experimenting, observing, and then enacting on it, and using data for our purposes.
Well, every month is Pride Month here at TV, so we have this particular time frame. But I don't really use keywords that much because of a lot of the things you just said. So I find that's not very helpful to me, frankly, in getting a sizable audience. And I want a sizable audience. So I put all of that money towards social. And what I do is I boost posts that talk about the content that say nice things, since I'm not abusive. I don't boost the ones that say bad things. But more people say good things than bad things. But I boost other people's posts about us as much as I can. And what I find is then they start to expand their own audience. Not only are they connecting with each other, but it's helping me connect with more people. And by not using the keywords, I open myself up to an audience that does not specifically define themselves as queer. Because people have all kinds of different labels that they use for themselves, right? And it used to, when I was younger, you were gay or you were straight, pick a team, And now it's like, I meet with all these kids who I'm mentoring, it's like, well, we're fluid. It's like, oh, great. That's terrific.
I love that for you.
It's like, God. Back when I did that, I was just a tramp. But anyway, now it's better. But it allows people who don't necessarily define themselves to enjoy the content, get to know the content, like the content. That's part of the monetization, right? So not over-defining it so that you leave out other people who would enjoy your content just as well, and who might actually be part of your greater community, but not your very narrowly defined community.
Yeah, I oftentimes, so because of my film theory background, a lot of my friends are bored by me dissecting things, so I did start my own podcast, and then I put all my ideas there. But horror in general is specifically the gayest, queerest content, and also speaks very directly to women. And also, one of the most quintessential horror films is quite literally a civil rights tale, right? Night of the Living Dead is so specific, can be argued and has been argued by many scholars that it is a quintessential civil, like the basis of it is the start of the civil rights movement. It came out in 1968. And so that genre speaks directly to the underrepresented. Like, that is the point, that society is terrified of this group of people, whoever the monster is they don't understand. But you never ever see, you very rarely see, like Roxanne mentioned Blackula, which is incredible, right? But you never see horror films marketed during Black History Month. You never see them marketed during Pride. And so going back to the way that studios talk about their content, or content owners talk about their content, there's really a lot of opportunity to rethink the way in which we see movies based on this larger historical context. So, I know you want to say something.
Well, please say.
Well, I was just going to say, like, so how do we manage this evolution?
Yeah.
How do we add the context that was literally missing before because the people making them, distributing them, putting them out there don't see us?
Yeah, I don't have much experience in the, I think the same as Paul, using metadata tags and all that, but to speak to what you're saying, I think overall, just the approach, I think we should just be the context as opposed to adding context, and I think it's just that flip around of what I said about Black culture, pop culture. It's just, we're literally here, we are part of the world, we're part of America, everybody is, but it's still in contrast to what the mainstream is, which is always the opposite, and we're always fighting and we're always resisting. I don't know what the real answer is. I just think the real perspective and the real sort of approach is to change our language, change our sort of perspective, and just have, in our own way, each individually, is just have a way to start fighting, quite honestly. And sometimes it's just about owning. You have a mainstream entertainment industry, so it may not always apply there or may not be applicable, but I think individually, especially when you're talking about your team, behind a team, it's like, this is not just Pride Month, Black History Month, it's just all day long, 24/7, because we're here all day long, 24/7. And so when you start living that truth, and you start speaking that truth, and you start believing that truth, it is what it is the truth. And so I think that's a helpful way of just approaching this problem. At least, you won't have the answers, but you'll at least have the direction.
I was just going to speak from perspective, when it comes to curating, because, yes, there's a content that happens to be Black, Hispanic, Asian, what have you, but like I said, I think for me, when thinking about curation, decision-making, and informing, having these very packets behind the scenes, really looking at, like I said, not only having Black films for Black History Month, when we do other stunts, for like Shark Week, we can't remember the theaters, the L. Cool J and Samuel Jackson movie, but like
Deep Blue Sea.
yes, but just going beyond that, just always looking at our varied audiences and not segmenting them to like, okay, this period will only promote this film, this period will only promote this. Really just looking at content holistically across two varied minorities. I wouldn't even, like you said, not to mention minorities, but like audiences and all, and not being segmenting like this particular population, that particular population. Just present the content to specific households, to every different household. And we should do that now that we have it with data and specific content recommendation. Personalization, I think that's going to be the big evolution of content, is making sure that every TV household is like, all right, like you're not going to be served the same content unless it happens to be like a big premiere that, you know, a big SWAT platform happens to pay promotion for, but just ensuring like, hey, I'm going to serve you, my responsibility using data, and we're serving you all the varied content that's more applicable to you, more maybe addresses your needs, rather than you searching for, you know, so-and-so content.
Feels like it goes back to authenticity. It doesn't feel, I think there's always this concern that you don't want something to feel disingenuous, like when these tentpoles come around, now's the time to start unveiling it. That's why I was saying we really make an effort to just make it a part of the great catalog we have in our library. So if you go to our Shout TV flagship channel, maybe you're going to have a day of martial arts, you're going to have a day of Mystery Science Theater 3000, you're going to have a day of just regular action films, but guess what? Some of them are female directed. You'll see Point Break on there. Then maybe it's a day of The Temptations and Soul. Just really making it a part of that catalog without sort of fragmenting it out, just to reinforce the authenticity. It belongs with all of this quality content. It deserves, you know, an audience that deserves exposure.
Yeah, I have a filmmaking approach which is about corrective history. Movies, the one thing they do is they create a myth, and Francois Truffaut said the one thing a movie should do is it has to create an illusion, but at one point in time pierce that illusion and tell the absolute truth. La La Land is a perfect example because it tells this beautiful myth of these white people who love jazz, which is a lie, we all know. But that tells the truth, that white people co-opt things that, you know, white people co-opt things. So it is a total lie, and yet absolutely the most true form of like reality. And it makes it very confusing if you keep, you know, if you don't have the context, you're not living the context. And especially, you know, not to get all theoretical, but like in a postmodern world like TikTok, where the original reference of something is lost, people forget that they're listening to a myth. And you see that, you don't have to get political, but like, you see it everywhere you go, right? People don't understand when they're listening to a Lotta song, they're actually listening to a Mariah Carey song, but they're also actually listening to an 80s song, right? It happened in music a really long time ago, and it happens in movies and TV shows currently. So with about 10 minutes left, I really wanted to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Yes, please.
Hey y'all, my name's Nigeria. So I love movie, I love like film, music, all of the things. A lot of times we focus on specific dimensions of diversity instead of intersectionality. How do you, as like filmmakers, for TV, all of the things, actually making TVs, like how do you formulate like intersectionality and get away from like these verticals of Black, Hispanic or Latin, queer, all of the things? Like how do you find intersectionality?
I think my approach is it's segmenting. It's like if you do have a category of an audience, if it's Black women, that's just the broad version of it, and there's actually queer Black women. Then there is Black women who have a certain perspective, or Black women who are considered alternative. Whatever label or thing you want to put on it, I just think about audiences again, and then thinking about how do you segment that audience, an individual, even if there's a mainstream that sort of lays on top and adds to the top. People have their own identity even within the subgroups themselves. So.
For us, the only stuff that really works is intersectional. So I mean, we're kind of at the intersection of, you know, queer and Black, queer and Asian, queer and Latino, queer female, queer, you know, go down the list. That's kind of what's interesting today. And the stories, you know, yes, of course, we still do queer white male stories, but God, they're a small percentage of what they were even 5 years ago, 3 years ago. That's just not what's happening at the moment. And to some extent, so I'm kind of enjoying riding the wave of it right now. And finding these exciting stories, which coincidentally or not, are all kind of intersectional. So, yeah, that's what works.
My perspective from the filmmaking side is when you make something so utterly specific, it becomes much more universal, right? People have seen the tale of Beauty and the Beast millions of times. They just don't realize it. Like there's a common understanding of what it is to be human. So that's why your presence in your place of work, your voice in culture, in community, and in the world, and in voting is so important, because if we don't know what your specific lived experience is, we don't know how to connect one another, right? I don't know how to connect to you, you don't know how to connect to me. Even though we don't have the same lived experiences, we feel and emote and our brains operate, and we sort of have this shared understanding of like loneliness, compassion, empathy, fear, anger, and those are the driving forces of storytelling. So that's, I think, why getting so specific and telling stories about your uniqueness is automatically intersectional, because there's no monolith that is trans, there's no monolith that is queer, there's no monolith that is black, or there's no monolith that is woman or Asian. Like, you know what I mean? None of us are one thing. More questions. We have 6 minutes left. Let's keep it rocking. Burning questions. I see you. Go ahead.
Well, I guess my question, my name is David Paul, with Golden Media Group. I guess one of my questions is, with technology and like understanding like what people like, and going through algorithms and trying to figure things out, how do you get people to see things that they didn't know they would like, or find something new that's beyond what the algorithm says? Well, they always watch this is my echo chamber, versus trying to find something that's outside that would get people to see something new or exposed to something new in an organic way, not something that feels forced.
So what I call this is customer journey. So when we look at our the user groups, right, we see what true crime fan might watch.
Yeah.
He might watch cooking shows. And then we kind of use that as part of the content recommendation and personalization, if you opt in, so that someone who watches true crime, they may get cooking shows. Or we look at like, okay, if certain demographics, a certain audience are liking, let's just say, Chuck Norris action films, they might like movies like Beauty and the Beast, because we look at it's like you look at a Venn diagram. We're looking we're refining our data where the personalization presents that. So like, you might not know you like this, but there's other folks similar to your interest. Doesn't mean that they have to be the same kind of background or age group, but just happens to be that there's other folks who are watching Chuck Norris 80s films that happen to like wine documentaries, so that we'll push it to them, and then the data keeps informing, like, hey, did that work? Did this person never clicked on wine documentaries but was watching, Delta Force, are they now watching wine documentaries? And then it informs like, hey, pair Chuck Norris and wine. It works. That's kind of how we go about it.
I love that. I think that when you look at intersectionality, I think technology knows us better than we do in terms of how many ways in which we're different, like how many data points that I have, like the fact that I prefer soft toilet paper as opposed to hard toilet paper. It dictates many other things about my personality that I literally didn't know. But it's true, it's arbitrary things like that, like I prefer lemon dishwash soap as opposed to lavender, and what that will say about me, right? Amazon has been doing that for years, and they're getting really good at dictating what socks I will buy. I don't know how they do it, but over time, like the more you slice and dice what we do and how we see it and how we operate, you really can figure out like what does make us tick, right? Because horror, drama, like the difference between the drama of like Traffic or the drama of Steel Magnolias, even that drama category is like, there's no way to predict, but it's slicing and dicing it. I think if you're a retailer or no retailers, getting them to remove genre or expand what that means, or starting to use things like keywords. I harp on this at Sony all the time of, there has to be more than one way in which we understand our movies, because if we don't understand what they are, then when we distribute them, how on earth are you all going to understand it? Because you won't even understand or read our avails to say like, okay, here's what our marketing team when they look at things, they can't even dissect the titles that we have in terms of like how they can sell them. It's a very big problem.
Can I add one? You
No.
look like you're about to say something.
Should we fight?
Please no.
No, my tidbit, I was just going to piggyback off that, because going back to keywords, like I was saying, just because it's tagged a certain way doesn't mean it's a positive representation of a group of people as well.
Yes.
So I think that's also something for us to figure out how to
100%.
get out.
I was just going to say, we think about music and how we have playlists now, whether we're making it individually or it's curated for a mood, and I think the mood transcends all the categories how we define ourselves, and I think that's a good way to approach our video content, is really just by mood. So.
And I would just offer a little perspective, which is, don't rely too much on these keywords and these audiences created by Facebook. And I have found they kind of suck. And if I rely on them too much, I fail. So what I've had to do is create my own sets of data, manage my own audience, because Meta in particular, which has Facebook and Instagram, their audiences with regard to queer people are terrible.
Terrible.
They're terrible. So if you're saying, oh, I'm going to use Meta's audiences, you're going to fail.
Yeah.
So
Agreed. I think that's the driving point of all of this is they do not have the right people understanding how to categorize and detail out the audiences that they're talking about, and it's just like, well, then don't. Yeah.
The good news, I would say, if there's a ray of hope, is our humanity, as much as they might know about what toilet paper you're using, our humanity is very hard to categorize. And it's a much broader, more nuanced subject matter that these algorithms, sharp as they are, can't quite get. And I find that for young people in particular, they're really bad. 25% of Gen Z now defines themselves as queer. When I was that age, 5% of society defined themselves as queer. That's a very big difference in 30 years, 20 years.
10 years. Yes.
All I can say is I was there when they made the first horror movie. But anyway, I'm just saying that the technology that thinks it is all that and knows us so well, I think we know ourselves better. So let's not lose that piece of it, which has to do with creativity, which has to do with nuance, and don't overly rely on these audiences that are created for you by big tech, because everybody has access to those audiences, right? You need to find your audience. You can use that as a starting point, but that should not be where you finish.
I think that's actually an excellent point, and I know that we're out of time. I encourage all of you to come up to these panelists and continue these conversations. If you're open, if you see this, then they're not open. Manage your own boundaries. But this is really fruitful conversation. Can we have a big round of applause?